Honestly, there's no joke at the top of this, just color me deeply impressed. Hello interwebs, I hope you're all doing well, and welcome to my review of the technically season 3, but I guess they're calling it New Horizons. Regardless, the premiere of the Orville Electric Sheep. It has been a hot minute since this show has been on the air. I believe the last season that came out was back in 2018 or 2019, somewhere in that vicinity, and then it's like switched to Hulu, and we weren't even sure it was going to come back, and then production had shut down for COVID for quite a while, so this show has frankly been through a lot. But finally, it is gracing our airwaves again, and I will be entirely frank with you. As my opening sort of statement showed, I am incredibly impressed with this premiere. I've been fairly open on like Twitter and some live streams and things that I have been a fan of the Orville season 1 and season 2, but I have never like particularly loved it. I thought season 1 of the Orville was okay-ish. It felt like Star Trek The Next Generation light and still felt kind of mired in a lot of the problems that I saw with Next Generation, but less forgivable now that it was like updated for a modern day. And then also had a couple of those like Seth MacFarlaneisms that I didn't particularly enjoy. But then season 2 showed a marked improvement to me that it was really trying to still pay homage to The Next Generation, but also trying to start its own path and chart its own path forward with its own unique identity. But it never really, at any point in that season, outside of maybe like the identity episodes, which this season premiere is very much coming off the heels of, I never thought it like really captured like the heights of what I would want for this show. And so coming into this season, my expectations were not like sky high, but I will be frank, this premiere just shocked me. The quality on display in this premiere, I was frankly dumbfounded as I was watching it, because I'm like, wow, this is actually trying to go for some complex and nuanced discussions of a lot of really hard themes. And I'm gonna say this right up front before we get into the nitty-gritty of this. And this is not something that I figured I would say for the Orville of all shows, but we're gonna be talking about some pretty heavy topics here. Just content warning all around. And I wish the show, by the way, had given a content warning for just discussions of suicide. It's a problem I also had with Star Trek Picard Season 2, if we're being honest. But regardless, I just want to be very clear, we are gonna be discussing that, so just know that going in. But again, frankly, I did not expect this season to really be delving into any of that, especially coming right out of the gate with the first episode. So I'm going to go full spoilers here, but let me just talk kind of generally about some of my thoughts, just kind of looking at what this episode of the Orville gave us. First and foremost, you can definitely tell they have a budget for this season. Not that the past seasons looked all that bad, but that the cinematography, the FX budget, just the look and feel of everything is incredibly high quality. And as someone who has been somewhat spoiled by the level of production on like recent Star Trek shows, that is actually saying something, because frankly, this premiere episode looked really, really good. The second thing that stuck out to me with this premiere is how much the show has really tamped down that parody comedy angle that the show initially started with. We had already started to see that towards the middle of season 2 of the show, but very much here, like, this show does have a more positive, upbeat feel to it from the beginning, kind of reminiscent of older Star Treks, but it will get to dark places and be willing to stay there. And it honestly, some of the moments in this episode really struck me with the growth and maturity in the storytelling that this season has gone through. Like, I was just shocked, like, wow, they are really not undercutting this moment in a lot of ways that they would do in previous things. They didn't like cut it away with a joke. They didn't cut it short. They let moments sit pretty long. I was just, again, the maturity of storytelling has just vastly improved from last season to this one, and we had already seen that growth starting in season 2, so all of that is just really great. And then the final thing that I'll just say generally before we start going through the episode is I was really pleased with the fact that this episode really was trying to wrestle with a bunch of really complicated interwoven topics, and yet never felt the sometimes old Star Trekian need to like stop and like have the moment be like, this is the message of the episode. Like, don't get me wrong, I do love those sort of like moments where like we get these very didactic, like, this is what this episode was about moments. But I feel like with this episode, given the themes of prejudice, mental health, suicide, reeling with death, coming to terms with one's prejudice, like all of these topics are sort of interwoven, and there's no easy answers given, nor is there one like issue that I could really say was like, this is what this episode was about. It's really just a complex web of things, and I really appreciated the show just being like, all right, we're just gonna deal with the morass of it all. And outside of one singular concern I have with how they depict one of the issues in this episode episode, namely around suicide. I have one concern that we'll talk about when we get into it. But other than that, I was really deeply impressed with just the well-handled complexity of how they handled a lot of this. But enough generalities. Let's get into some of the specifics. As per usual, kind of like talk beat by beat through the episode and just go through it linearly, and we'll sort of discuss things along the way. So we start off with the scene that we saw way back in the initial trailer for this season, where we saw Marcus kind of reliving the battle with the Kalons that we saw in Season 2's Identity. And this was a very thrilling sequence. Again, I wish we hadn't been spoiled from it within the trailer. I know they have to sell the show, but this was a really great, thrilling sequence that, while there's this big battle going on, hones us in on one little kid sort of running through it and just getting to see the horrors, like the absolute horrors of what was going on in the background of that episode that we didn't get to see. And then I initially was sort of like off-put by the fact that we see that Marcus sort of is waking up from a dream, because I thought like, oh, that feels kind of a cheap way to just start off with an action beginning and that's all you were going to do with it. But I really liked that this does come back down the line, that this sort of horrific dream that Marcus is having does come back in some way later on. From there, though, we get reintroduced to Isaac, and we get to see some pretty, honestly well-depicted prejudice leveled at him that comes from a very understandable place of people feeling anger and resentment towards Isaac for, number one, helping the Kalons initially in their attack, but then also against him specifically just because of who he is. And that's shown just generally through people like leaving him behind, but I really love that they come in with Charlie, who is a new character, well played by this actress, by the way, coming and sitting down in front of him and telling him a very harrowing story about the death of her friend. I really loved her scene of being like, I wish you could feel, because if you could, you deserve all the pain. Not that I agree with her, but just her resentment coming through, I thought was just, the actress played it very, very well.
And I will say I was initially frustrated by the fact that she said that her friend that died was just a close friend. And I'm like, oh, are we never going to get an actually explicit queer character on the show? And no, Bortus doesn't count. There's a video that I did on my main channel about that. You can check it out if you're curious about why I don't necessarily count Bortus as a queer character. And while that is deeply frustrating, and I do think that the show should have some LGBTQ representation on some level, because it reeks of Berman-era Star Trek problems, I at least appreciate that this character that we just met in this flashback was not queer. At least we aren't told that they are, because that would have been a bury your gays moment right in the first few scenes of this new season, which I also would have not been happy about. So, complicated feelings. We need LGBTQ representation, but I guess I'm glad that it wasn't a bury your gays moment.
But then Isaac comes back to his lab and sees the word murderer drawn on his wall, very clearly meant to evoke hate speech. And it was at this moment, after only about 10 minutes or so, I was like, all right, you've got me really intrigued, Orville. Then after the beautiful new opening credit sequence, like it looked gorgeous, by the way, we get a few moments on the bridge, like Gordon saying, I love this job, after he's ordered to take a guy out for drinks. I thought that was wonderful, just sort of reminding us of who these characters are and still kind of remaining that jovial tone despite some of the darker subject matter. I liked that. But then we have the captain and Kelly going down into the lab to sort of hear more about this investigation. And I really liked how when Isaac sort of said that there's been a lot of data of people giving me hatred and it's just been me studying it, I liked seeing Ed's sense of shame at that. Like, I think Seth MacFarlane, you know, I don't think he's the best actor in the world, but his, like, really hitting that feeling of, like, the sense of shame he feels that human beings are showcasing this prejudice towards Isaac, I thought was really subtly portrayed, and I thought was very, very nice. And then I also really liked that we got the scene immediately after this with Mercer calling Charlie up to his office, and Charlie just kind of expressing a lot of bigotry. Like, how do we not know that he's not a sleeper program that's going to kill us all? Like, that sort of very really echoes a lot of, like, bigotry that people will target towards minority groups. And it's kind of complicated in terms of the metaphor that they're using here, because obviously Isaac comes from, like, a group that actually did a lot of harm. So there is some rightful sort of resentment at him personally, and then also his species as a whole, that I think Ed expresses really well, his sort of complicated feelings on that. And I like that he was open and honest about that and showcasing that he's a flawed man and not just like this, you're not going to show any big... He's like very honest with Charlie about his own complicated feelings about Isaac being on the crew. But then I liked that sort of understanding acceptance of the complexity that Ed has juxtaposed with Charlie, who is showcasing some real internalized bigotry that echoes conspiracy theory and targeted stereotypes that someone would level against someone from a different group than they are. So I like that while Ed could understand Charlie, we're definitely shown a juxtaposition in these slight differences in the subtlety of the writing between how these two see Isaac. From there, we get what I'm going to call the showing off the budget sequence, where we get to see Gordon flying in the new shuttle around and them sort of playing games with the drones. And I initially just thought that that was all this was going to be, but there are a couple things here that I thought were really good. I love that Gordon, again, also connected with Charlie on their complex feelings as well, showing that it's not just Ed who has these problems. It's pervasive across the ship that people have these complex feelings about Isaac, and him sort of sitting on the bridge and Charlie being very clear, like, just sit in the masochism of it all, and Gordon not being able to, like, hold on to that hate even though he does sort of feel it. I like the, again, very juxtaposing different views of complicated feelings around this entire situation with Isaac, and I really liked that. And then I also liked that while this was just sort of showcasing what this new shuttle can do and all that things, that it also allowed Charlie to have like fun moments with the crew, because our introduction so far has only been through the lens of her being angry at Isaac, which could make her a very flat and one-note character, but seeing her getting to like have fun and joke around with everyone else allowed her to feel much more complicated as a character, and so I really liked that. And then obviously also her ability to like dimensionally think, as we see showcased here, comes back up later on in the episode. But then we get a very sweet scene with Claire showing up with Ty to check in on Isaac. And again, I like this, a nice little reminder of their prior relationship, and that Claire does have some feelings and worries of Isaac's well-being after such hatred leveled at him. Like checking in on his mental health. And while Isaac himself doesn't necessarily have what we would consider like feelings and mental health, I like that she sort of is trying to handle him in that way. And I think this is a good point to kind of stop, because it will become relevant down the road. It is interesting how they are coding Isaac in this, because when we look at him, I hate to necessarily always make the comparison to Star Trek, but it is sort of an easy comparison to make given just the very clearly that that's what this show is wanting to evoke. But when I look at like the Next Generation, and the most analogous character to Isaac that we have would be Data. Data is a character who, he said he didn't have emotions in the Next Generation, but in that show, I would argue that even before the emotion chip, Data did have emotions. He just processed them a different way. And the way that he processed them within that show often felt analogous to people on the autism spectrum. As someone who is on the autism spectrum, we don't always showcase our emotions in the same way, and sometimes we overthink and have to like think them out piece by piece, as Data would do on that show, versus Isaac, who is much more depicted as like not having any emotion at all. And so I was a little bit conflicted here, because while I do dislike the sort of like using autistic coding to like code someone as inhuman, as in Data's case, as much as I like him, I also do like that I could relate to Data in a lot of ways through that autistic coding, so that complicated feeling on his character. When I look at Isaac, it's hard for me to like be like, this feels analogous to something, but I like how that we do get the sense that while he is impenetrable, there are ways that he is feeling emotions in some way, shape, or form. It's slightly different, and I'm not entirely sure if it's as powerful as Data. Again, I hate to compare necessarily, but I do find it to be an interesting difference, and one that I'm sort of curious to see how we sort of develop throughout the series as this goes forward. From here, though, we do learn that Marcus was the one that put the murderer paint on the walls, and I liked, again, the complexity shown here that Marcus is just very angry. He's like, I am suffering PTSD. It does feel very childish in a way that it's kind of very, I don't want to say necessarily black and white, but it's a lot less nuanced as Charlie. Because I feel like Marcus and Charlie, as we see later on in the episode, have very similar views on Isaac and just being unable to completely forgive him in this moment. Charlie does have some nuanced thoughts on it, as we saw displayed with that whole masochist discussion that she had with Gordon, whereas Marcus is very similar in his thinking, but it's much more like, I just hate him, I'm angry at him, because he's a kid and can't really articulate his feelings in exactly the same way, even though he's probably coming from the exact same place as Charlie. And so that was really well developed. And I also like that Ed had understanding here, being like, look, we'll let this one slide because we can see how complicated it is, and again, coming from his own place of understanding with all of this. And so, again, a wonderfully, beautifully portrayed scene. But then we have Claire sort of instigating Isaac to come and apologize to Marcus, and Isaac not really being able to emotionally give the apology to Marcus that Marcus needs, nor would I think, even if Isaac had been able to emote that and showcase that emotion to Marcus, if Marcus would have still been able to accept it, and he tells him, I wish you were dead. Again, coming from that understandable place of anger and vitriol that he's feeling. But then this leading to one scene that just, it really honestly shocked me, was that Isaac dies by suicide. Yeah, it was incredibly difficult to see. And I really loved and also had complicated thoughts on how this was depicted throughout the episode, because there are some really wonderful scenes of people wrestling with the complexities of Isaac dying that way. Like, I love the moment where Claire comes and tries to comfort Marcus, and he's sort of not looking at her and says, like, look, it was his choice. It's not your fault. Do not blame yourself. Because obviously he does, after what he said to Isaac, and sort of putting it like, no, that was a choice that Isaac made. And then I also really love the funeral sequence, because initially we see that there's not a lot of people there at the funeral, like it's only half full. And I like that, showcasing the complex feelings that the crew has for him. But then Ed sort of stating, like, I understand that he wasn't loved by everybody, but it's still part of this. And Mark is sort of wrestling with that too, hiding around the corner. But I absolutely adored the scene that Claire and Kelly had, where Claire is very much wrestling with, like, that I kind of put my emotions on this numb place and I haven't really felt them at all. And so now that Isaac's dead, I don't know how to feel them. And I love that Kelly gave the advices to go back to places that were important to you. As someone who has done that too, not necessarily with someone who has died, but had numbed myself to people who went through something horrible and me not feeling that as much, and then having to like reopen myself to that in certain cases, like that felt very, very true. And then when she goes to the, I forget what it's called, but the holodeck for all intents and purposes, and she sees that Ty is trying to recreate Isaac through like this AI version of him on the holodeck. We didn't get to explore that as like a whole idea, but I like that it's touched upon, that is something that people like to do, especially kids trying to find ways to understand and reckon with death. It could have been a whole episode just dealing with that, but I like that at least it's brought up here. But then the scene where Claire just revisits the spot of her date with Isaac and just breaks down crying, and we just sit with that in silence for a few minutes, was deeply, deeply powerful. And then from there, we also get another scene that I really enjoyed with Lamar, where he's having sex with this spiky girl. I forget the name of her species, but I was like, oh yes, this feels like Gene Roddenberry's vision right here, just sex with alien species, and she apparently got some good sex, which I thought was very, very cute. But I also liked the reminder of like Isaac's weird idiosyncrasies with like him giving the fork as a gift to Lamar. Again, that felt like kind of an autistically coded trait, sort of him not understanding how to give gifts, but it's sort of reminding Lamar of a sweet moment that he had with Isaac. And then I did really enjoy the way that this discussion afterwards about suicide that Lamar has with the girl that he's sleeping with. Apologies to her, I forget her name. But I liked the discussion of cultures where she sort of sees like, oh, in our culture, we see suicide as a personal choice, that choosing to die is not something necessarily to be looked upon because you didn't choose to exist. And I like that that was brought up as like a concept that other cultures may have, and some cultures do have that here on Earth as well. But I did like that Lamar sort of wrestled and pushed back against it, being like, that's kind of messed up. Like, no, that's not okay where I come from. But I like that different cultural perspectives were brought up, even if they were pushed back against. I thought that that was a nice display and discussion. However, this does bring me to my one concern that I mentioned earlier. That being said, I want to be very clear that I am having a concern with this, but I'm not condemning it necessarily. But the concern that I have is that Lamar comes up with a plan after this. He sort of has a spark of an idea to be able to resurrect Isaac. And spoilers, Isaac does come back at the end of the episode. So my concern kind of rests in the ability to undo suicide. Again, I'm not condemning it, but I have conflicted feelings about, like, if you're going to do a storyline about suicide and have the character die for all intents and purposes, I don't know if it's... I just have conflicted feelings about character coming back from that. And while the episode doesn't necessarily wrap it up with a nice positive bow at the end, which I liked, and we'll talk about that, but I guess I don't know. Without going into my own personal history with that stuff, I have conflicted feelings about resurrecting a character who dies that way, even in a work of fiction, even through science fiction mumbo jumbo. Again, not a condemnation. It's just one of those, like, I'm sitting with it, and I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. That being said, though, I do like that it does enable a discussion with Charlie, who is the only person that can save him through sciencey mumbo jumbo, and her prejudice and not wanting to be able to save Isaac because of who he is. That she, because of her prejudice, does not feel that she could save Isaac. And I love the scene where Ed goes and talks to her, because he gives so many good arguments just back and forth, and he kind of shifts it a few times during the conversation. Like, he appeals to her sense of camaraderie, saying like, oh, you have a duty to save your comrade. He appeals to some logic, being like, oh, so you're only willing to save someone based on your feelings on the day. I just love all these arguments, and I love that she's just so stuck in her own anger at Isaac. And I love that Ed calls out, like, you are holding on to a monopoly on grief, and it is getting tiring. And I really, And I really appreciated that. And then I love that this gets complicated even further with the Kalon attacking at that exact moment, the worst possible time for that to happen, because it just reinforces Charlie's own prejudice and feelings at that moment to be reminded of this. And we get a decently done action sequence. Not much to say about it other than it was really well done, but it leads to this moment where Ed orders her to do this thing and she says no. And he leaves her of duty, as well he should. But then we get another really wonderful scene between Charlie and Marcus, which I really did like because, again, I think Charlie and Marcus are the same places, or at least were at one point in the episode. And Marcus, feeling direct guilt of the situation, sort of pushes her to save Isaac. And I like that she does save him, not for him. And so there's still prejudice to work through with Charlie. I don't think we're over it yet, but I like that. I like that there's that complexity. And so this discussion about helping someone medically when you don't agree with them, I think was really well handled, because honestly, I am of the side that you don't get to decide who to help when you need to help them medically. Like, as a trans person who knows that I could go into a hospital and be denied healthcare service specifically because I am trans, because maybe a nurse or a doctor be like, oh, I don't want to help a trans person. I could die because of that choice, as many LGBTQ people have. No, you don't get to choose who you save and who you give medical services to. I really don't believe in that. But it is a complicated topic, one rooted in people's prejudice and where that comes from. And so I like that it is very humanized with Charlie here. It's not forgiven, it's not looked past, but it is deeply humanized within her character. But then this leads me to the scene that I really did appreciate that we ended on, which was Claire sort of talking to Isaac about his choice to die by suicide. And I liked that it brought up all these things of like, why were you feeling that? And while, again, Isaac doesn't feel emotions, he does have the same sense of logic that people who make that choice go through. As someone in my own life, and again, warning here, as someone in my own life who has been suicidal, one of the things that I would tell myself several times repeatedly is that my existence is a net negative on the world. And while I know that that is complete bullshit now, I understand Isaac sort of saying like, oh, I feel like I am a drain on everyone else around me. And that is bullshit. But I understand the logic of that like weird warped sense of logic that he has. And that him sort of being gaslit by everyone's prejudice around him, by who he is, again, as someone who has faced marginalization and depressive thoughts because of people harassing me because of who I am, that would come into play. And so while I have conflicted feelings about Isaac's lack of emotion in terms of like what it actually relates to in terms of depicting a person, I do like that there is some truth within that. And I like Claire saying like, you are wrong about this and come to me if you are having these thoughts again, like stating that you have an outlet, you have a safe person to come to. And that is one of the most important things to give to someone who's having suicidal thoughts, just giving them that outlet. I thought that was really deeply well handled. So that ends out this episode, and I have to say, given the fact that I have talked this much about this, I did not expect that. I thought that this was going to be a review that was going to last 8 minutes long when I sat down to watch this episode, and I have just talked for 30 minutes. I am honestly shocked. This was fantastic. And while I have some complex feelings about how some of these things were depicted, I liked that it does leave me in those complexities and not just like making me feel like, oh, they just did this wrong. Like I would say about episodes earlier in this series, like About a Girl, like episode About a Girl, I'm just like flat out, you depicted these issues deeply problematically and wrong. Here I'm like, while I don't necessarily know if I agree with how it's depicted here, I don't think you did it badly. It's just complicated. So I am just shocked. Like honestly shocked. Orville, you've deeply impressed me. Did not expect this. Fantastic premiere episode. Few things to say, though, to all of you before I wrap this out, though. Number one, I want to hear your thoughts down in the comments about this episode. Were you as shocked as I was, or were you like, Jessie, you should have known. You should have known. But jumping off of that, number two, I just wish to set the tone here. Sadly, on YouTube, there's always this undercurrent of hyperbolicism and antagonism, especially within particular fandoms. And I just wish to state that I really love the Orville. I'm a fan of the Orville. I'm also a fan of modern Trek. There are some places on both YouTube and elsewhere that have pit these two fandoms against each other, saying like, if you love the Orville, you're dumb and you're stupid and you don't really understand Star Trek, and vice versa, saying like, oh, the Orville's the only real Trek and New Trek's kind of dumb and stupid and I hate it, and Discovery, blah, 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 it's so woke, blah, 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 blah. I want to be very clear. If you dislike modern Star Trek, that's totally okay. If you dislike the Orville, that's also totally okay, and vice versa. I am not here to judge anyone's preferences on their media types or likes. In fact, I encourage it. I want to have conversations, even if you disagree with me about modern Star Trek, about the Orville. I want that conversation. I encourage it. I want to foster that community. What I do not want to allow or foster is the deconstructive, toxic conversations that sometimes happen in these spaces with people yelling at each other and getting angry. I know most of you out there understand that and know that. I just wish to be on the record setting the tone. This is not me saying all Orville fans are horrible. I am an Orville fan myself. I just wish to set the tone for the conversation because I found that in some spaces it has gotten toxic. So just making the expectation very clear in my comment section. But onto more positive news, just really briefly, as I said in my Obi-Wan Kenobi video, I am having surgery next week, so while I will be reviewing the Orville going forward week to week, next week's review might be number 1 audio only, and might also 2 be a few days late, just because I don't know if I'll have the energy to review this when it comes out. I may, it depends, we'll see how I'm feeling the day of, but I just want to set the expectation that you might have to wait a little bit for next week's review, but then going forward, I would expect I'll probably be on time with each review going forward. That's everything that I had to say. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you, as always, my friends, live long and prosper. And damn, Orville. Just damn.